right, folks, it is August of 2025, and we got the gang back together again. Jason's here. I'm here. I'm in a hotel outside of Navy Gold Coast currently. It's a barrel of laughs. You've been seeing me post about it on LinkedIn, but it is the height of summer. And as we have talked about in previous episodes, this summer is very different from previous CMMC summers because we just did an entire episode with Daniel all about the crazy number of memos that have been coming out regarding CMMC, and we got another one for you. This time, it's a little bit of a Summit 7 scoop, if you will. Anyways, a few months ago, the government announced plans for a huge, and I mean huge, hyper-complex space-based missile defense system called Golden Dome, and everyone in the defense industry is licking their chops at this opportunity because realistically, you're talking about at least a decade of development and easily $1 trillion in spending, according to some of the estimates that are out there. But that being said, in July, as we talked about last week, the Secretary of Defense signed a memo that highlighted CMMC as a key part of the department's strategy for supply chain security overall. And apparently, we have recently acquired a memo that was signed just a few days after the SecDef memo by none other than the inimitable champion of CMMC, Katie Arrington, as acting DoD Chief Information Officer. This memo went to senior Pentagon leadership and the defense agency directors, and it was called Golden Dome for America Cybersecurity Requirements. And guess what was at the top of the list, everybody? CMMC, including level 3 certification. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
After being gone for a couple weeks, Jacob, I did not realize how much I fully appreciate those lead-ins that you bring us at the beginning of every show. Not just because it, sets the stage and lets us know what the show is going to be about, but for me, in a more personal sense, right? I kind of missed it. But in this episode, when I saw that we were talking about Golden Domes of America and CMMC, I thought that you and producer Dustin came up with some witty nickname for bald-headed men that were going to star on podcasts and produce podcasts, right? So it
Nope,
helped
nope. I do have a glorious massive dome, but the only thing bigger than that is the Golden Dome program.
Yeah, so yeah, and apparently that's what it is. We thought the CMMC program was the end all be all for protection for defense contractors, and now what we're seeing is it's serving as part of the minimum. The minimum baseline is serving as a part of the minimum baseline or the minimum standard of entry if you want to participate. And realistically, what's going to be the thing that fuels defense spending? I would say possibly for the next decade, right?
It's a ton of spending. It's a huge amount of stuff. I know, like in the Huntsville area out here in San Diego, where there's a lot of aerospace and defense for space-based capabilities, it's all anybody's talking about. And so it's the talk of the town in whatever town you're in, if it's a defense town. But now we have this memo that is linking the two because I think some people thought, well, this is a big, huge initiative. It's very important. We need to go fast. We're trying to accelerate things. And this memo is going to throw water right in your face and be like, hey, this is a big thing that everybody's very interested in. And there are significant cybersecurity requirements that come with the deal. If you want to play in this gigantic pile of decades long money, you're going to have to do cybersecurity requirements. And this memo is very clear about that.
I think significant's a very generous term. This lays out clearly there are a lot of steps and hoops that you have to jump through if you want to benefit from this.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into it. So like I said before, the memo has not officially been published anywhere. It was signed on July 24th, and somehow I started getting emails with it. People started DMing me with it on social media. Like this memo is out there, but it isn't posted anywhere by DoD. So we will add a link to the official DoD posting of this memo as soon as it's available. But until then, you're just going to have to get by with screenshots and like our blog. But if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably seen this memo. If not, we're going to go through and summarize it. So just to cover the top end here, Golden Dome for America is what they're calling this program, or GDA, Golden Dome for America. And the memo's logic basically goes like this. They say that GDA's success relies upon the innovation and the technology from the defense industrial base. Defense industrial base companies of all sizes are targets of cyber actors for espionage, intellectual property theft, disruption, all that stuff. Therefore, the DoD must ensure the security of the GDA program through supply chain cybersecurity requirements for the entire ecosystem. And since this GDA defense industry base ecosystem is so huge, that's a lot of people. So if you are doing anything around missiles, space-based interceptors, satellites, satellite ground control, doesn't really matter what branch or what program, this is probably going to reach out and touch you somehow. So it's worth paying attention to. The memo goes on to say that the GDA program office will ensure that all vendors who handle CUI must comply with the prescribed level of information handling, and that includes but is not limited to DFAR 7012. We did a whole episode. DFAR 7019. We did a whole episode. DFAR 7020. We did a whole episode. And last but not least, when published and effective, the revised DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7021. That is the clause that will specify a specific level of CMMC certification that you need to achieve. This is at the beginning of the memo. This is like a 5-page memo with tons and tons of requirements that directly relates to the biggest defense program in the history of the United States. Certainly the biggest defense program and outlay of anticipated spending in decades and decades. And the first thing that they talk about for cybersecurity requirements are the classic go-to standard DFARS cybersecurity clauses verified by CMMC that we've been talking about for years. That's the first thing they lead with. Just like that SecDef memo that came out where we did that episode last week about where the first thing they lead with is verification that you have implemented the requirements. Not something new, not a revision to the requirements, same verification.
So, Jacob, I think that it's crazy to think about that they would require people that are going to participate in probably what will be the last line of defense for our national defense strategy, right? To have certain provisions in place that they've expected or assumed that you've had in place for over a decade. I don't think that that's too outlandish of a
I
request. Do
mean,
you?
no, no, and I think that, if somebody really digs back into the history, we'll link them below, but, a couple years ago when people were really writing off CMMC, we did whole episodes on these obscure policy documents from the DoD, the National Defense Strategy, the National, Cybersecurity Strategy, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Strategy. These were documents that not a lot of people read, that they didn't really get a lot of coverage, and if you go watch those episodes, we're like, it's clear as day that they are positioning this program as a core part of the department's overall strategy. And here we are, SecDef memo. We announced this big new program, and what's at the core of the cybersecurity of this program? CMMC, just like you could have seen coming from those strategy memos a couple years ago. This isn't a new thing that they're elevating CMMC. They're just continuing the same policy position that they've been expressing for several years now. And so I think it makes total sense. What's very interesting about the memo where they talk about these clauses, they go on to sort of explain what 7021 is. They say the revised DFARS clause 7021. Remember, CMMC 1.0 created this clause, but the upcoming 48 CFR final rule will revise the clause. And that's when the phased rollout will begin. They say this revised clause will require contractors to verify compliance with the security requirements outlined in Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 170 and Part 2002. Longtime viewers of this podcast will know 32 CFR 170 is where the CMMC policy is codified. That is effective as of December of 2024. That was all the rulemaking that we waited on from 2021 up through the end of 2024. So that's what they're talking about. 32 CFR 2002 is the federal CUI program. So they're basically saying if you're going to be a vendor under the Golden Dome for America initiative and you're handling CUI, you're going to implement the requirements to protect CUI, and you're going to meet the requirements that are outlined in the CMMC program for you to prove to us that you are protecting CMMC and CUI requirements. So they talked about NIST SP 800-171 requirements, but then they go on to mention DoD policy for breakthrough technologies and critical programs, including but not limited to requirements in NIST SP 800-172. This should be sending off alarm bells for everybody because we're talking about, think about the types of programs that the DoD has said would require CMMC level 3, the requirements in 800-172. This is all the quote unquote whiz bang stuff that they talk about, the super high speed, super awesome, crazy asymmetric capability that they're really concerned about. That would be hypersonics, lasers, space-based systems, or even space-based interceptors for hypersonic missiles, which is what Golden Dome is. So if you're involved in that world, suddenly CMMC level 3 becomes an issue. And the memo goes on to say, contractors participating in the GDA program with enhanced protections will be required to implement and verify compliance with the selected requirements in SP 800-172 as outlined in the revised DFARS Clause 7021. So very good chance that solicitations and programs for Golden Dome will include CMMC level 3, no question.
Yeah, I actually, you say very good chances as if there is a chance that they won't. And the way that I interpreted this was, I
Yeah.
don't know why I added an extra syllable to that, but the way that I interpreted this was it is going to be there. And the way that I took that in, and I don't know if you saw how steamed up I got when you mentioned it, but it's the first kind of mention in the wild as to this is a contract that CMMC level 3 is going to be in. I think for the longest time, even when we talked
Yep.
about 172, Jacob, the thing that we got most in the questions was, well, how do I know if my contract's 172? And besmirkingly, we basically would say because you had the whiz bang stuff, right? And that was kind of the only outlet.
Yeah.
We had an inclination that if you did some stuff that was really high test, that more than likely your contract's going to be under it, no matter what. You do something that's under this high test Golden Dome of America program, and you are going to be required to meet CMMC level 3.
Yeah, before the only indicator that we really had was if you had a DIBCAC high assessment, right? So if
Mm.
DIBCAC showed up to your
But
company
that was
of
still
their
shooting fish
own
in a barrel,
volition
bro.
and said, that was yeah, and it was a good indicator, but it wasn't a sure thing. So
Yeah.
now we've got another data point. It's like if DIBCAC showed up and gave you a high level assessment, that's a good indicator you need level 3. If you're planning on doing some really cool stuff under Golden Dome, then level 3 is a thing that you need to be paying attention to. It's still not exactly what the criteria will be, but this is this is something in black and white that says 172 enhanced requirements. It makes sense. If you're strapping space-based interceptor and sensors and all this stuff onto satellites and you're launching them into space, that's a little bit more than like, "Oh, we gotta do MFA." You know what I mean? It's another level above that. So just
I
be aware, that they're definitely gonna be requiring level 3.
and I also feel like just level 3 for the company that's responsible for giving them the missile or giving them the radar, just that sole prime contractor, I don't think that that's enough, and I feel as though the way that I interpreted this again is that it's not enough. Do you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see how they plan it out, but, the way that the policy is set up right now is whatever the level that the contract is for the prime, if that same data flows down the supply chain, that same level flows down with the data. So, I'm not saying everyone's gonna need level 3 as a result of this memo, I'm just saying pay attention and talk to your customers about what's going on because this memo is making it a real thing, so it's no longer just speculatory.
Yeah, that I see that might be one point
Alrighty, so
that might be one point in which we differ here because I feel like just, when we read these things, we kinda dig into them a little deeper and we're like, "Well, this kinda means this." I feel like that it put me on a wormhole, and the wormhole was that this is kind of all the way down. They want the entire supply chain just because bill of materials requirements and all that extra
yeah.
stuff, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, for sure. Just as a reminder for everybody, quick history lesson. If you go way, way back and you read or listen to my history of CMMC video prior to the 2020 rule coming out, there's always a reason why these rules come out. And one of the big catalysts for the 2020 rule was the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act. And that had language in it that said, we want a framework to prove that these cyber requirements are being implemented because we know they're not being implemented.
Mhm.
Prior to the NDAA, there was a Senate Armed Services Committee report, and they issued this whole statement that said, why are we doing this? Why are we putting this language into the NDAA? And the Senate Armed Services Committee said, the committee is concerned that prime contractors are not overseeing their subcontractors' compliance with these cyber requirements. The committee believes that prime contractors need to be held responsible and accountable for securing DoD technology and sensitive information. And then at the very end, they say developing a framework, which we would go on to call CMMC, developing a framework to enhance the cybersecurity of the DIB will serve as an important first step in securing the supply chain. A first step in securing the supply chain, not the only step, not the last step, the first step in doing a bunch of stuff for supply chain security. And I think that's important to pay attention to because everyone's very focused on CMMC as its own thing. That is only one thing that's mentioned in this memo. We're highlighting that because most people who listen to this podcast are focused on CMMC, but there are 18 other things listed, across pages and pages of this memo. Primarily, you'll have to read the memo for all the details. We'll get you guys a link as soon as it's available. But the two main buckets for these requirements are primarily software security and supply chain security. And this stuff extends far beyond just CMMC. So if you're in either of those two worlds, this is definitely a memo that you need to be paying attention to. But I think that it's an illustration of how these things can take a really long time. But clearly, CMMC was not where anybody was planning on stopping. There's way more stuff coming after CMMC that contractors are going to have to pay attention to. CMMC was just the first step, quote unquote.
Yeah, and if you think about it, look at some of the measures that they're putting in there. We know that CMMC is kind of covering the confidentiality aspect of the requirements for this Golden Dome of America, the vendors of the Golden Dome of America, right? But if you look at some of the other things, I think we start tweaking with integrity, with availability. The supply chain stuff, especially, is making sure that the stuff that we are going to depend on to either ammunitions or radar systems or whatever, all of that stuff remains available and online and readily available in case we have to expand and do things of that nature. So this is probably this may be ignorance showing the most comprehensive set of cybersecurity requirements or a checklist for anybody to do business in the DIB that I've seen since I've been working in the CMMC ecosystem.
Yeah, I'd say as far as just a general sort of blanket memo at the very top, I'd say that's probably true. So let's just talk about the highlights of what we see in these two sort of
Sure.
categories because it's not the most organized list on the memo. So like I said, there's software security, there's supply chain security. Under the software security grouping of these requirements, they talk about stuff where if you're doing software development, if you're a software vendor, if you're involved in the software aspect of Golden Dome, which I can only imagine as a complex system of systems is a lot of people, they mention things like the NIST Secure Software Development Framework and its requirements. And they also go on to say that DoD reserves the right to request artifacts from the software producer and developer that supports the attestations that they've made to conforming with the secure software development practices in the NIST framework and the requirements that are outlined under Executive Order 14028. So this isn't just a list of things where they're like, we want you to tell us, we want you to self-attest to this software development framework and these secure software development requirements. They also say at the end, we're going to ask you to prove that this is true. Sensing a pattern here, anybody? We've seen this pattern before when it comes to basic cybersecurity requirements and CMMC comes to these software requirements, they're going to start to ask for proof for that. They go on in the other category requirements, talk about supply chain security. They talk about NIST SP 80017 or 161 revision 1, not a document that we've talked about on this podcast a whole lot, but a very important flagship document for supply chain security controls, requirements, how to run a program. It's really been the thing that has underpinned this change in deity's philosophy about how to talk about supply chain cybersecurity. The memo says that vendors must assess supply chain risk in accordance with a DFARS clause we've never talked about, 252.239 7019. So we're in a different part of the DFARS. So it sounds familiar. We normally talk about 252.204 7019. Here we're in subpart 239. This has everything to do with supply chain risk. I have never even read that clause, so maybe we're going to have to do a whole episode on the basics of this clause too. They say all vendors must document, monitor, and maintain valid provenance of system components to ensure that those components are genuine. The GDA program shall perform supplier assessments and reviews on all components within the program. Each vendor will provide a complete bill of materials, which will include hardware, software, firmware, microelectronics, chemical, raw materials, on and on and on. That's really going to, in the words of our very own Scott Edwards, whenever we got a hold of this memo, he said, that's really going to throw people for a loop. Uh, Fun fact, as this memo started circulating around, what Scott said, we got an email just hours later from people being like, CMMC level 3, how do we do supply chain bombs? This is not a joke. Like, this memo is really making the rounds. So it's definitely something that people are paying attention to. I'd say outside of the highlight of CMMC leading the charge here at the top, the way to think about this memo is its software security requirements, supply chain security requirements.
So if we substituted a golden dome, right, where it's supposed to be an anti-missile defense, et cetera, if we substituted that and maybe replace it for a scenario that we read about in, I think, a book that both of us read called Battlefield Cyber, we understand why this is super important. And not to dig down in that hole too deep, but think about why it's important to verify all the components that are associated with these, because maybe the smallest component at the smallest level of the supply chain has been compromised, but it's the one that you need to activate something that helps with the defense. And so that's why I think that this is particularly important, just because of that and the sensitivity. There was one other interesting thing that stood out on this, stood out in this memo to me, Jacob, and I think that you have one as well. But the one that stood out to me, and I have a question to you, is it says the GDA program shall perform supplier assessments and reviews on all components within the program. Does that mean that the GDA is going to appoint assessors to assess those cybersecurity implementations, depend on the CMMC implementations, or are they going to go through and assess the vendors, like they said, request evidence from software vendors or whatever it may be? That was a bit of confusion for me in the memo.
Yeah, the memo doesn't explain how they're going to do that. Obviously, they want to do that. This rhymes a lot with the early policy around CMMC 1.0, right? We've got this big issue, we've got an emergency, we've got a bunch of effort and initiative behind it. We're just going to go, we're just going to put out guides, we're just going to make it happen, right? Does this sound familiar? And they're like, "Hey, we're doing supply chain security. You got to do all this stuff, and we're going to come make you prove that we're going to do it." And everybody's first question is, how are you going to do that? Who is going to do that? When are you going to do that? We don't have the answer yet. But it doesn't look like they are just saying things to say it. It looks like they're really going to try. That could potentially be, I don't know, you could have additional training modules for CMMC assessors that you could bolt this on to what they do. There could be some DoD function that does it. I doubt they would establish an entirely new program just in order to do those types of assessments, but I don't know. But yeah, we've been hearing more and more, even though we don't necessarily do podcast episodes on it, about their focus on 161 requirements, verifying supply chain requirements, verifying provenance of components. I mean, as bad as the cybersecurity side of the house has been in the DIB for the DoD for years, supply chain security and counterfeit parts, ensuring provenance of where these parts come from, has been as big, if not bigger, of an issue for longer than just cybersecurity itself. So I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do that. One of the interesting things that jumped out to me, probably just the last point here, one of the requirements that they list in this memo is GDA vendors must subscribe to the NSA's threat intelligence sharing offering that they offer in their cyber collaboration center. So the NSA Triple C's threat intel sharing. I find this very interesting because all of those tools from NSA Triple C, all the tools from DC3, all the tools from Project Spectrum, and all these things that are out there, they're all mostly free, but you don't have to use them. This memo says if you're going to be a vendor under GDA, you have to subscribe to the threat intel sharing function offered to you for free by NSA, which we've never seen in a memo before. They go on to say vendors will be expected to conduct vulnerability monitoring and scanning. I mean, that's part of the requirements in 171, verified by CMMC. So that's not anything too crazy. They say NSA Triple C offers additional services that may augment a vendor's responsibility to demonstrate this capability of vulnerability monitoring and scanning. I think this is interesting because one, they're saying you have to participate. And two, it's sort of telling you like when you run your vulnerability monitoring and scanning, it might be hinting at the types of things that assessors or the government are going to be looking for. Like, are you doing vulnerability monitoring and scanning the way we want you to do it? They don't really give you that guidance in 171. They don't really give you that guidance in CMMC. But here they say when we talk about vulnerabilities and mitigating them, we're talking about at least the things that NSA is putting out in their threat intel sharing. That's very helpful because it's really the first time that we've kind of had anything like that from the DoD. So at least it doesn't cost you any money to participate, and it kind of gives you an example of like, do you do this? Yes, we do. We participate in this program, and then we remediate the vulnerabilities that come to us through this program. Bada bing, bada boom. We're doing the thing that you would like us to do. So I think that that is an obscure kind of like one-off requirement in the memo, but it's actually maybe one of the more helpful ones.
Yeah, and it's discussing about why it's helpful for this particular situation and not pushing why it's helpful for a situation that it necessarily doesn't apply to, as we've seen in history, right? In this situation, the situation in which it applies to is making sure that we know if there are any kinks in the armor in the entire Golden Dome of America program, right? And the best way for that collaborative
Yeah.
intel sharing and for them to remediate those findings and to get the message out quick enough to everybody to remediate it fast enough is to go through a collaboration like this and make it required for you to do it. Now, if you don't participate in that, which I think incident sharing and intel threat and things like that kind of have been a weakness in the performance metrics for the DIB thus far. So,
Yeah. Honestly, I was kind of surprised that they didn't say that you're required to participate in the DIB CS program because they expanded that program so that non-cleared defense contractors can participate. They went through a whole rulemaking process for it. It's really kind of the thing that they talk about from the DoD as being their cyber services and their threat intel sharing.
yep.
So I guess I'm a little surprised that they didn't put DIB CS. They put NSA Triple C, but I mean, I'll take it. I'll take it. I think it's helpful. So I think that's an interesting part of the memo. Just to wrap up here, this is the last episode before Secure the Div on August 26th. So you guys have seen the post about it. We've talked about it for a couple weeks now. It's a free half-day event. We're talking about the big topics that we've seen so far in 2025. Scott Edwards is going to be there. Joy Beelan's going to be there. We're talking about things that our SOC analysts have seen on the floor. We're talking about enclaves with Daniel Akridge and why they're not all they're cracked up to be, everything in between. So check out the link below, register. It's free. We do it every summer. It's kind of like the event at the end of summer before all the craziness starts again, heading into the fall. That's on August 26th. And yeah, who knows what other memos are going to come out between now and next week or now and next month. It seems like we get one every week at this point. But this is just another interesting notch in the pattern here of we went from obscure policy documents to SecDef memo to final rulemaking to Golden Dome memo. So maybe we're going to get a memo like this for every major program that comes through, and that's just how it's going to play out. I don't know.
I'm okay with it. If we get memos that are positive
Yeah.
and that do good things like this, keep them coming. Keep signing those memos like Oprah, Katie.
I mean, it does seem to work. It gets people's attention, but we'll keep up with them. Let us know. Let us know too in the chat if you have seen other memos, because like I said, we got this through like back channels where people just sent it to us. So who knows what other kind of memos are floating around, but we'll keep up with them. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.